The Ruthless Millionaire CEO rejects all women but falls hard for his bold and kind new maid. Harrison Sterling had built walls so high around his heart that even he couldn't remember what lay buried beneath, until a woman with calloused hands and fearless eyes walked into his pristine world, wielding nothing but a mop and the audacity to look him straight in the eye. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Industries' 42nd floor like an angry fist demanding entry. Harrison Sterling stood motionless behind his mahogany desk, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the storm ravaging Manhattan below. At 34, he commanded a business empire worth $3 billion, yet the only sound in his corner office was the methodical tick of his platinum Paytech Philippe, a reminder that time, unlike people, never disappointed him. "Mr. Sterling." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, tentative as always. "The Henderson merger documents are ready for your signature." Stone, as everyone called him, a nickname that perfectly captured his emotional landscape, didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about the woman who'd walked out of his penthouse that morning, her designer heels clicking an angry staccato across his Italian marble floors. "You're impossible, Harrison." Victoria Ashworth had shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails clutching a Hermes bag that cost more than most people's annual salary. 3 years, and you've never once said you love me. You're made of stone." She wasn't wrong. Stone had ended their relationship with the same cold efficiency he used to close business deals. No emotion, no explanation beyond the simple truth. He didn't love her. He'd never loved anyone, and he never would. "Send them in," he finally replied to his assistant, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire and destroyed his soul. The merger went through with surgical precision. $50 million changed hands in the time it took most people to finish their morning coffee. As the lawyers filed out, congratulating themselves on another successful deal, Stone remained at his window, watching the storm. His phone buzzed. Another text from another woman whose name he'd already forgotten. "Last night was amazing. When can I see you again?" Stone deleted it without reading it twice. They were all the same, beautiful, ambitious women drawn to his wealth like moths to a flame, only to discover that getting close to Harrison Sterling was like embracing a glacier. Beautiful to look at, impossible to warm. 23 blocks away, in a cramped studio apartment in Queens, Amora, Washington was fighting a different kind of storm. Her landlord's latest eviction notice lay crumpled on her second-hand kitchen table, the red ink seeming to pulse with threat in the dim light of her single working lamp. 30 days, she whispered to herself, running her fingers through her natural hair, still damp from the rain that had soaked her during the 40-minute bus ride home from her previous job, a cleaning position at a downtown office building that had eliminated her position that very morning. At 26, Amora had calloused hands that told the story of her life, dishwashing at 17 to help her grandmother pay rent, scrubbing floors through college, working 3 jobs to pay off her nursing degree, a degree that hung on her wall like a cruel joke, since no hospital would hire someone with her background. Her grandmother's voice echoed from the bedroom, weak but defiant. "Amora, baby, don't you worry about me. The Lord always provides." Amora smiled despite the tears threatening to spill. Grandma Rose had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8, and even now, battling diabetes and heart disease, the 74-year-old woman remained Amora's source of strength. "I know, Grandma," Amora called back, her voice steady even as her hands shook while she counted the bills scattered across the table. $37.42. That was all that stood between them and the street. She pulled out her phone, a cracked screen held together with tape, and scrolled through job listings. Most required experience she didn't have or offered wages that wouldn't cover their rent. Then she saw it. Immediate opening. Domestic staff, Sterling Estate, Manhattan, Upper East Side. Excellent compensation for qualified candidate. Discretion and professionalism required. No experience necessary. Will train. The salary listed made her catch her breath. If this was real, it would solve everything. She could pay their rent, buy Grandma Rose's medications, maybe even save enough to eventually use her nursing degree. Her fingers hovered over the contact number. Places like the Sterling Estate didn't hire people like her. She'd grown up in foster care after Grandma Rose's health first started failing, bounced between homes where she was reminded daily that she was different, unwanted, not quite good enough. But desperation made her brave. "Nothing to lose," she murmured, dialing the number before she could change her mind. The phone rang once. "Sterling Estate, Margaret speaking." The voice was crisp, professional, with a kind of authority that came from years of managing wealth. "Hi, I'm calling about the domestic staff position." Amora's voice came out stronger than she felt. "Experience. I've been cleaning professionally for 8 years, Amora said, which was true if you counted every job she'd ever held. References. Amora rattled off the names of 3 previous employers, hoping none of them had updated their contact information. "Can you start immediately?" "Yes, Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. sharp. Ask for Margaret. Don't be late. Mr. Sterling doesn't tolerate lateness, laziness, or familiarity. You'll be working directly in the main house, so absolute discretion is required. One mistake, and you're gone. Understood?" "Understood." The line went dead. Amora stared at her phone, her heart pounding. She just talked her way into a job at one of the most exclusive addresses in Manhattan. But as the reality sank in, so did the fear. She'd heard stories about Harrison Sterling. The business magazines called him brilliant but ruthless. The gossip columns called him New York's most eligible bachelor and most heartless man. One article had dubbed him the CEO who doesn't believe in love. What do you think will happen when Amora meets Stone for the first time? Will his cold reputation match reality? Or is there more to him than meets the eye? Share your thoughts below. That night, Amora stood in front of her small closet, trying to choose an outfit that would help her blend into a world where she didn't belong. She settled on her only pair of black slacks, bought for a job interview she didn't get, and a simple white blouse she'd found at a thrift store. "You look beautiful, baby," Grandma Rose said from her wheelchair, her weathered hands reaching out to smooth Amora's hair. "But more than that, you look strong. That's what matters." "I'm scared, Grandma," Amora admitted, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "What if I mess this up? What if they take one look at me and know I don't belong there?" Grandma Rose's eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp with wisdom, focused on her granddaughter's face. "Listen to me, Amora Washington. Your mama and daddy didn't raise you for 5 years just to have their baby girl bow her head to anyone. You belong wherever your feet can take you and your heart can handle. You remember that?" Amora nodded, tears finally spilling over. She kissed her grandmother's forehead and whispered a prayer that had sustained them both through years of struggle. "Lord, just open a door. That's all I need." The next morning, as Amora stood before the imposing iron gates of the Sterling estate, she felt like Alice staring down the rabbit hole. The mansion beyond was a testament to wealth so vast it seemed almost fictional. 3 stories of pristine stone and gleaming windows, surrounded by gardens that looked like they'd been sculpted by angels. Her reflection in the brass nameplate made her look small and out of place. But Grandma Rose's words echoed in her mind. "You belong wherever your feet can take you." She pressed the intercom button. "Margaret here. It's Amora Washington. I'm here for the position." The gate swung open silently, and Amora walked through them into a world that would change everything she thought she knew about herself, about love, and about the man everyone called Stone. But as she approached the servants' entrance, she had no idea that 40 floors above Manhattan, Harrison Sterling was staring out at the storm clouds, completely unaware that the woman walking into his perfectly ordered world was about to turn it upside down. Margaret Thornton had been managing the Sterling estate for 12 years, and in that time, she had perfected the art of reading people within 30 seconds of meeting them. The young woman standing in her kitchen doorway, however, was proving to be an enigma. Amora Washington possessed something Margaret rarely encountered in domestic staff applicants. She looked directly into your eyes when she spoke. Not with defiance, not with desperation, but with a quiet confidence that suggested she knew exactly who she was, regardless of where she stood. "You're younger than I expected," Margaret said, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent decades managing multi-million-dollar households. She was a woman in her early 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a navy blue dress that spoke of understated professionalism. "I'm 26, Amora replied, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their slight trembling. The kitchen alone was larger than her entire apartment, with marble countertops that gleamed like mirrors and appliances that probably cost more than she'd earned in the past 2 years combined. Experience with luxury homes. The truthful answer was none, but Amora had learned long ago that survival sometimes required strategic honesty. "I'm a fast learner, and I pay attention to details. I won't let you down." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. Most applicants would have fabricated impressive references or exaggerated their experience. This woman was either refreshingly honest or dangerously naive. "Mr. Sterling is particular," Margaret said, studying Amora's face for any sign of intimidation. "He values privacy above all else." You will not speak to him unless spoken to. You will not interrupt his routine. You will be invisible unless he requires your presence. Can you handle that? Amora thought of Grandma Rose's medical bills and their eviction notice. Yes. Follow me. The tour of the Sterling mansion was like walking through a museum of obscene wealth. Each room was more opulent than the last. Persian rugs that probably cost more than most people's houses. Artwork that Amora recognized from her art history textbooks. Chandeliers that cast rainbow prisms across walls painted in colors she didn't have names for. But it was the silence that struck her most. Despite its size and grandeur, the house felt empty, almost hollow. No family photographs, no personal touches, nothing that suggested a human being actually lived here rather than simply existed within its walls. Mr. Sterling's study, Margaret said, pausing outside a set of mahogany double doors. Never enter without permission. His bedroom suite is on the 3rd floor, strictly off-limits. The east wing is his private gym and office. You'll focus on the main living areas, guest rooms, and the library. Does he have many guests? Amora asked, then immediately regretted the question when Margaret's expression sharpened. Mr. Sterling values his privacy, she repeated, the words carrying a clear warning. They continued the tour, but Amora's mind was racing. She'd expected to work for a wealthy man, but this felt different. The house wasn't just expensive, it was isolated, like a beautiful prison designed to keep the world out and its occupant trapped within. You'll start in the library, Margaret said, leading her to a room that took Amora's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stretched 3 stories high, accessible by rolling ladders and a spiral staircase that seemed to ascend into infinity. Leather-bound volumes in every language imaginable filled the shelves, their spines creating a tapestry of knowledge and wisdom. It's beautiful, Amora whispered, forgetting herself. Mr. Sterling reads extensively, Margaret said, her tone softening slightly. The books are organized by subject and author. Dust them carefully. Some are first editions worth millions. Replace everything exactly as you found it. As Margaret handed her the cleaning supplies, Amora caught sight of a photograph tucked between 2 books on a lower shelf. It showed a young boy, maybe 8 years old, laughing as he was lifted into the air by a man whose face was partially obscured. The child's joy was so pure, so innocent, that it seemed to glow from within the frame. Margaret. The voice cut through the library like a blade, deep, authoritative, and cold enough to freeze the air itself. Both women turned to see Harrison Sterling standing in the doorway, and Amora's first thought was that no photograph could have prepared her for the reality of his presence. He was tall, at least 6'3", with broad shoulders that filled out his charcoal grey suit with a kind of precision that came from custom tailoring. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath entirely. They were the color of storm clouds, grey with flecks of silver, and they held an emptiness that was almost physical in its intensity. This wasn't just coldness, this was the complete absence of warmth, as if someone had reached into his chest and extracted every capacity for human connection. Sir, Margaret said, her voice immediately shifting to a tone of professional deference. This is Amora Washington, the new domestic staff member I mentioned. Stone's gaze moved to Amora, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. She'd been looked at by men before, some with desire, others with disdain, but never with such complete emotional detachment. It was as if he was cataloguing her existence without acknowledging her humanity. Fine, he said, his voice carrying no more warmth than his eyes. Ensure she understands the rules. He turned to leave, dismissing them both with the casual indifference of someone who had never needed to consider other people's feelings. But something made Amora speak. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Sterling. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Stone stopped mid-stride, his back still turned to them. Margaret's face went white with horror. She'd explicitly told Amora not to speak unless spoken to. Slowly, deliberately, Stone turned around. His eyes found Amora's, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other. She didn't lower her gaze or bow her head. She met his stare with steady brown eyes that held no fear, no servility, just honest acknowledgement of one human being to another. You don't need to thank me, he said finally, his voice carrying a strange note that might have been confusion. You'll earn your wages. I know, Amora replied simply, but a job isn't just about wages. It's about dignity and respect. So thank you. The silence that followed was so thick it seemed to have weight. Margaret looked like she was witnessing a natural disaster in slow motion. Stone's expression hadn't changed, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or irritation. Amora couldn't tell which. "Margaret will explain your duties," he said finally, and this time when he turned to leave, he didn't look back. The moment his footsteps faded, Margaret whirled on Amora with barely contained panic. "What were you thinking?" she hissed. "I told you." "I was being polite," Amora said calmly, though her heart was racing. "Where I come from, you thank someone when they help you." "This isn't where you come from," Margaret snapped. "This is the Sterling estate, and Mr. Sterling doesn't appreciate." She stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "He doesn't engage with staff on a personal level. Ever." "Why?" The question slipped out before Amora could stop it. Margaret's expression softened, revealing a flash of something that might have been sadness. "Because that's who he is. And if you want to keep this job, you'll remember that." But as Amora began dusting the endless rows of books, she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen in those storm-cloud eyes. It wasn't just coldness, it was pain, buried so deep and protected so fiercely that he'd built an entire personality around keeping people away from it. 2 hours into her first day, Amora discovered that the Sterling mansion's beauty hid a profound loneliness. Every surface was perfect, every room immaculate, but there were no signs of life. No coffee rings on tables, no newspapers left folded, no indentations in couch cushions that suggested someone actually lived here rather than simply existed within these walls. She was polishing a crystal decanter in the main living room when she heard voices from the hallway. Stone's deep baritone and a woman's higher, sharper tones. "You can't keep doing this, Harrison," the woman was saying. 3 years of my life, and you end it with a text message." "Victoria, we discussed this yesterday," Stone replied, his voice carrying the same emotional temperature as winter wind. "We want different things. I want you to love me." The woman's voice cracked with pain. "Is that so unreasonable? To want the man I've been sleeping with for 3 years to feel something, anything, for me? I was honest from the beginning about what this was. What it was. It was nothing. 3 years of nothing." The sound of expensive heels clicking angrily across marble filled the pause. "You know what your problem is, Harrison? You're so afraid of feeling anything real that you've turned yourself into a machine. A very wealthy, very handsome machine. If that's how you see it, then we both made the right decision. God, you're impossible." The woman's voice was moving toward the front door now. "I actually feel sorry for whoever's stupid enough to fall for you next. At least I only wasted 3 years. She might waste her whole life waiting for you to become human." The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the crystal in Amora's hands. She stood frozen, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping but unable to move without revealing her presence. Stone's footsteps approached the living room, and she quickly resumed polishing, keeping her eyes down as he entered. But she could feel him watching her, and when she glanced up, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the gardens with an expression she couldn't read. "How long have you been in here?" he asked without turning around. "About 10 minutes, Amora replied honestly. "Did you hear?" He stopped, seeming to change his mind about the question. "Never mind." But Amora's heart was breaking for this man who stood surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine yet seemed utterly, desperately alone. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. "She was wrong, you know." Stone turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." "The woman who just left. She was wrong about you being a machine." Amora set down the crystal decanter and looked directly at him. "Machines don't choose to be alone. They don't build walls. Only people who've been hurt do that." The silence that followed was deafening. Stone's face had gone completely blank, but his hand had clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're right, I don't," Amora agreed. "But I know what it looks like when someone's protecting themselves. I've been doing it my whole life." "Margaret was right about you," Stone said, taking a step closer. "You don't understand boundaries." "Maybe not," Amora replied, refusing to back down despite the intimidating intensity of his presence. "But I understand pain. And you're drowning in it." For a moment, something raw and unguarded flashed across Stone's features, a crack in the armor that revealed the wounded man beneath. But it was gone so quickly that Amora almost doubted she'd seen it. "Clean the library," he said coldly. "And next time, keep your observations to yourself." He walked out, leaving Amora alone with the crystal and the weight of what had just happened. She'd crossed a line, multiple lines, and she knew it. But something about Harrison Sterling's carefully constructed emptiness called to every protective instinct she'd ever possessed. Do you think Amora went too far by confronting Stone about his pain? Should she have minded her own business, or was she right to see through his cold exterior? Let us know what you think. That evening, as Amora rode the bus back to Queens, she couldn't shake the image of Stone standing by that window, surrounded by luxury but utterly alone. She'd seen that same look in her own mirror during the worst moments of her life, the expression of someone who had convinced themselves that needing nothing was the same as having everything. "How was your first day, baby?" Grandma Rose asked when Amora walked through their apartment door. "Complicated," Amora replied, sinking into the chair beside her grandmother's wheelchair. "I think I might have made a mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Amora told her about the confrontation with Stone, about the sadness she'd seen beneath his cold exterior, about the way he'd looked at her like she was both dangerous and fascinating. Grandma Rose listened without interrupting, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When Amora finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," Grandma Rose said finally, "the Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't understand why. Maybe especially when we don't understand why. What if I lose the job? We need the money, Grandma. Money comes and goes, baby. But if the Lord is calling you to help heal someone's heart, that's work that lasts forever." As Amora prepared for bed that night, she found herself wondering what had happened to Harrison Sterling to turn him into such a fortress of a man. What kind of pain had to burrow so deep that you'd rather feel nothing than risk feeling it again? She had no way of knowing that 40 floors above Manhattan, Stone was standing at his penthouse window, staring out at the city lights and thinking about brown eyes that had seen straight through all his carefully constructed defenses. For the first time in 15 years, Harrison Sterling couldn't stop thinking about what someone else had said to him. And that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or business rival ever could. The next morning arrived with the kind of Manhattan fog that made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Amora stood outside the Sterling estate gates at 5:55 a.m., 5 minutes early as always, but her usual confidence was shaken. She'd spent most of the night replaying her confrontation with Stone, wondering if she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Margaret answered the door with an expression that confirmed Amora's worst fears. "Mr. Sterling wants to see you in his study," she said without preamble. "Before you begin work." Amora's stomach dropped. "Am I being fired?" "I don't know," Margaret replied, but her tone suggested she thought it was likely. "Whatever you do, don't make it worse by arguing with him." The walk to Stone's study felt like a march to execution. Amora's hands were steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs as Margaret knocked on the mahogany doors. "Enter." Stone sat behind a desk that could have served as a landing pad for small aircraft, his attention focused on a computer screen that cast blue light across his sharp features. He didn't look up when they entered, and the silence stretched until Margaret cleared her throat. "Sir, Amora is here as requested." "Leave us," Stone said, still not raising his eyes from the screen. Margaret shot Amora a look that might have been sympathy or warning, then disappeared, closing the doors behind her with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. For 30 seconds, Stone continued typing, each keystroke deliberate and precise. Amora stood in the center of the room, surrounded by walls lined with awards, photographs of Stone with world leaders, and framed articles proclaiming him one of America's most powerful CEOs. But her attention was drawn to a small section of one bookshelf where the same photograph she'd noticed in the library sat, the laughing child being lifted into the air. "Sit," Stone said finally, his voice carrying no more warmth than it had the day before. Amora took the chair across from his desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. If she was going to be fired, she'd face it with dignity. Stone closed his laptop and looked at her directly. In the daylight streaming through his office windows, his eyes were even more unsettling, not just cold, but ancient in a way that suggested he'd seen too much and felt too little. "Yesterday, you said something to me," he began, his words measured and careful. "About pain and protecting oneself." "Yes, sir." "What made you think you had the right to psychoanalyze me?" The question was a trap, Amora realized. Any answer would sound presumptuous or insubordinate. But she'd never been good at saying what people wanted to hear instead of what was true. "I don't have that right," she said quietly. "But when you've lived through enough hurt, you recognize it in other people. It's like a language you never wanted to learn but can't forget how to speak." Stone's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You think you understand me because you've experienced hardship?" "No, sir. I think I understand what it feels like to build walls so high that you forget there's supposed to be a door. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Stone leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Tell me about your walls, Amora. The use of her first name caught her off guard. He'd pronounced it correctly, Rmah, with a slight emphasis on the middle syllable that most people missed. Sir. You said you've been protecting yourself your whole life. From what? This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd prepared for anger, for dismissal, for cold rejection. She hadn't prepared for genuine curiosity, and certainly not for him to turn her own words back on her. I'm not sure that's appropriate workplace conversation, she said carefully. Neither was your analysis of my emotional state, yet here we are. Stone leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I'm curious about the woman who thinks she can see through me so easily. Amora felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step would send her tumbling into an abyss she might never climb out of. But something in his tone, not kindness, exactly, but genuine interest, made her take the leap. I grew up in foster care, she said. My parents died when I was 8, and my grandmother couldn't take care of me because of her health. I learned early that caring too much about people who were going to leave anyway was a luxury I couldn't afford. Yet you live with your grandmother now. She's all I have left, Amora said simply. And I'm all she has. Sometimes you find one person worth tearing down the walls for. Stone was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. What makes you think I haven't found that person? Because if you had, you wouldn't be sitting alone in this beautiful, empty house, having this conversation with your maid. The words hung between them like a challenge. Stone's face remained impassive, but Amora caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested she'd hit something vital. You're very presumptuous, he said finally. You asked. I did. He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the estate's gardens. Your employment here comes with certain expectations, discretion being paramount among them. I understand. Do you? He turned to face her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. Because I'm beginning to think that discretion isn't in your nature. I won't discuss your personal life with anyone, Amora said firmly. But I won't pretend I don't see what I see, either. And what exactly do you see? The question was quiet, almost vulnerable, and it made Amora's heart clench with an emotion she couldn't name. Someone who's convinced himself that being alone is the same as being strong. Stone was silent for so long that Amora began to wonder if she'd finally pushed too far. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if it is? Then why does it look like it's killing you? The words escaped before she could stop them, and immediately she knew she'd gone too far. Stone's expression hardened, the brief moment of vulnerability disappearing behind walls that seemed to rebuild themselves in real time. You're dismissed, he said coldly. Report to Margaret for your duties. Amora stood, her legs unsteady. Mr. Sterling. That's all. She walked to the door, her hand on the handle, before something made her turn back. Stone was still standing by the window, but his shoulders had a defeated slump that made him look older than his 34 years. For what it's worth, she said softly, I don't think you're broken. I think you're just tired of carrying all that weight alone. She left before he could respond, but as she walked down the hallway, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks, the sound of glass breaking, followed by a curse that was raw with frustration and pain. Margaret was waiting in the kitchen, her expression unreadable. Well, I still have a job, Amora said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. What did you two talk about? Walls, Amora replied. And why people build them. Margaret studied her for a moment, then shook her head. In 12 years, I've never seen Mr. Sterling have a personal conversation with anyone. Staff, business associates, even his companions. He simply doesn't engage on that level. Maybe he's never had anyone who wasn't afraid of him. Most people have good reason to be afraid of him, Margaret said pointedly. Harrison Sterling destroys things, Amora. Companies, competitors, relationships. It's what he does. What happened to him? Amora asked. To make him like this. Margaret's expression softened slightly. That's not my story to tell. But I will say this, some wounds go so deep that they change the shape of your soul. And some people never recover from that kind of damage. As Amora began her work that day, Margaret's words echoed in her mind. She found herself paying attention to details she'd missed before. The way Stone's footsteps always sounded purposeful but never hurried, as if he had nowhere he actually wanted to go. The absence of any personal phone calls, despite his wealth and status. The fact that mail was delivered daily but no personal letters ever came, only business correspondence and charity requests. She also noticed that he was watching her. Not obviously. Harrison Sterling was too controlled for anything obvious. But throughout the morning, she caught glimpses of him pausing in doorways, observing her work with an intensity that had nothing to do with ensuring she was dusting properly. It was unnerving and oddly thrilling at the same time. The breakthrough came that afternoon while she was organizing the library. She'd been careful to replace every book exactly as she'd found it, but when she reached for a volume of Shakespearean sonnets on a high shelf, several other books came loose and tumbled to the floor. One of them fell open, revealing pages filled with handwriting, not printed text, but someone's personal thoughts written in blue ink. A journal. Amora knew she should close it immediately, should pick it up and put it back without reading a single word. But the page it had opened contained just a few lines written in a familiar hand. She asked me today why I built walls. How do you explain to someone that the alternative is letting people close enough to destroy you? How do you tell someone that love isn't a gift? It's a weapon that people use to control you, manipulate you, leave you bleeding when they decide you're not worth the effort anymore. The date at the top of the page was from the previous evening. Interesting reading. Amora spun around to find Stone standing in the library doorway, his expression unreadable but his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, closing the journal and holding it out to him. "Some books fell and you decided to read my private thoughts. It was an accident. I wasn't trying to. Weren't you?" He walked toward her with the measured pace of a predator, his eyes never leaving hers. "You seem very interested in analyzing my psychological state. Perhaps you thought you'd find some answers." "No, Amora stopped, realizing that anything she said would sound like an excuse. "You're right. I should have closed it immediately. I'm sorry." Stone reached out and took the journal from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. The contact was electric, sending a shock of awareness through her that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the dangerous attraction she'd been trying to ignore. "What you read," he said quietly. "What did you think of it?" The question surprised her. She'd expected anger, not curiosity. "I thought," she said carefully, "that it sounded like someone who's been hurt badly enough to believe that protecting himself is more important than living. And you disagree with that philosophy?" "I think," Amora said, meeting his gaze directly, "that the people who hurt you are wrong, and they don't get to define what love means for the rest of your life." Something shifted in Stone's expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You're very naive if you think love is always kind." "I'm not naive," Amora replied firmly. "I know love can be cruel and selfish and destructive, but I also know it can be the thing that saves you when everything else falls apart. The question is whether you're brave enough to risk finding out which kind you're being offered." They stood there in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the library windows, surrounded by thousands of books containing the wisdom of ages, but focused entirely on each other. The air between them hummed with tension and possibility and the dangerous recognition of two people who understood each other in ways that should have been impossible. "Why did you really take this job?" Stone asked finally. "Because my grandmother needs medicine I can't afford and we're about to be evicted," Amora said honestly. "Because I'm desperate and this pays better than anything else I could find." "And now? Why are you still here after I've been?" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Unwelcoming." Amora looked at him for a long moment, taking in the sharp lines of his face, the guardedness in his storm-grey eyes, the way he held himself like a man preparing for battle even in his own home. "Because," she said softly, "I think you're drowning, and I know what that feels like. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I'm in a position to throw someone a lifeline instead of needing one myself." The silence that followed was charged with an emotion neither of them was ready to name. Stone's hand, still holding the journal, trembled almost imperceptibly. "You don't know what you're offering," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been hope or fear. "Then tell me," Amora said. "Help me understand. What do you think Stone will reveal about his past? Will he finally open up to Amora, or will his fear of vulnerability make him push her away even harder? Share your predictions." For a moment, it seemed like he might actually do it, might tear down the walls he'd spent decades building and let her see the wounded man beneath. But then his expression shuttered, the vulnerability disappearing behind the familiar mask of cold control. Clean the rest of the library, he said, turning toward the door. And Amora? Yes. Stay out of my personal belongings. He left her alone with the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight and the weight of all the words he hadn't said. But as Amora returned to her work, she noticed that he'd left the journal on a nearby table, not hidden away, not secured in a drawer or safe, but simply set aside where it might accidentally fall open again. And she realized that maybe, just maybe, Harrison Sterling wanted to be saved as much as she wanted to save him. That evening, as Stone stood in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, he found himself replaying every word of his conversation with Amora. No one had ever spoken to him the way she did, without fear, without agenda, without the careful deference that his wealth and power typically commanded. It was terrifying. For 15 years, he'd lived by a simple rule: let no one close enough to matter. It had served him well in business, had protected him from the kind of devastating loss that had nearly destroyed him once before. But something about Amora Washington made him want to break that rule, and that desire felt more dangerous than any corporate takeover he'd ever attempted. He walked to his safe and withdrew a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, was a child's drawing of a house with stick figures labeled Daddy and Emma standing in front of it. His daughter. His beautiful, brilliant, irreplaceable daughter who had been taken from him by the one person he'd trusted most in the world. Stone closed the box and returned it to the safe, but the ache in his chest remained. Some wounds never healed. They just learned to live quietly in the shadows, waiting for the right person to come along and remind you exactly how much you'd lost. The question was whether Amora Washington was worth the risk of losing everything all over again, or whether he was already too far gone to have a choice. 3 weeks into working at the Sterling estate, Amora had developed a routine that felt almost comfortable. She arrived each morning at 6, spent her days maintaining the pristine facade of Stone's world, and left each evening with enough money to keep her and Grandma Rose afloat for another day. But comfort was a dangerous illusion when it came to Harrison Sterling. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a ghostly presence that she felt constantly but rarely saw directly. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of him leaving for work, his custom suits perfectly pressed and his expression set in the same emotionless mask he wore like armor. Other times, she'd hear him on phone calls from his study, his voice cutting through million-dollar deals with surgical precision. But it was the moments in between that haunted her, the times when she'd find him standing motionless in empty rooms, staring at nothing with eyes that held depths of pain she was only beginning to understand. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but would end with both their worlds in flames. Amora was dusting the main living room when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Mercy General Hospital, and her blood turned to ice. Ms. Washington, this is Dr. Patricia Chen at Mercy General. Your grandmother was brought in by ambulance about 20 minutes ago. The crystal vase in Amora's hand slipped, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of glass and water that mirrored the breaking of her composure. What happened? She managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. She collapsed at home. Her blood sugar levels are critically high, and her heart is under tremendous stress. You need to get here immediately. Amora's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the phone. Will she? Just get here as fast as you can. The line went dead, leaving Amora standing in the wreckage of crystal and flowers, her world crumbling around her. Grandma Rose was all she had, the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally, who had sacrificed everything to raise her when no one else would. What happened here? Stone's voice cut through her panic like a lifeline. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, taking in the scene with those storm-grey eyes that missed nothing. I have to go, Amora said, her voice breaking. My grandmother, the hospital called, I have to. She couldn't finish the sentence. The words kept getting tangled with sobs that came from somewhere so deep they felt like they might tear her apart. Sit down, Stone said, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. Tell me what happened. I can't sit down. Amora exploded, her careful composure finally shattering completely. She's dying. My grandmother is dying, and I'm not there, and I can't afford. She stopped, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. Oh God, I can't afford this. The treatments, the medicine, the hospital bills. I can't afford to save her. The admission came out as a wail of pure despair. Amora sank to her knees among the broken crystal, not caring about the glass cutting through her uniform, not caring about anything except the terrifying reality that she was about to lose the only person who had ever truly loved her. Stone was beside her in an instant, pulling her away from the glass with hands that were surprisingly gentle. Which hospital? Mercy General, but I don't have a car, and the bus takes forever, Anne. We're taking my car, Stone said, helping her to her feet. Right now. But your meeting, Margaret said you had. I don't care about the meeting. His voice carried an edge of something she'd never heard before, urgency mixed with what might have been fear. Let's go. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur of Manhattan traffic and Stone's Mercedes cutting through lanes with a kind of precision that suggested he'd done this before, driven like someone's life depended on reaching a destination in time. Amora sat in the passenger seat, her hands pressed against her mouth to keep the sobs inside, while Stone gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Tell me about her, he said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. What? Your grandmother. Tell me about her. Amora looked at him through her tears, confused by the request but grateful for the distraction. Her name is Rose. Rose Washington. She raised me after my parents died, even though she was already struggling with her health. She worked 2 jobs to put me through school, and when I wanted to quit college because we couldn't afford it, she sold her wedding ring to pay my tuition. Stone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She is, Amora whispered. She's the strongest person I've ever known. She used to tell me that love wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice you made every day, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. They pulled into the hospital parking garage, and Stone was out of the car before the engine fully stopped, coming around to help Amora out with hands that shook slightly as they touched hers. The emergency room was a chaos of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells that brought back every terrible memory Amora had of hospitals, of sitting in waiting rooms as a child, being told that her parents weren't coming home, that her world had changed forever in the time it took for one drunk driver to run a red light. Rose Washington, Amora told the receptionist, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She was brought in by ambulance. Are you family? She's my grandmother. I'm all she has. The receptionist's expression softened. Room 314. The elevator is down the hall. Amora started toward the elevator, then realized Stone wasn't following her. She turned to find him standing frozen in the middle of the waiting room, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Stone! She walked back to him, concern temporarily overriding her own panic. What's wrong? I can't, he said, his voice barely audible. I can't go up there. Why not? But even as she asked the question, she saw the answer in his eyes. The same look she'd seen when he stared at that photograph in his study, the laughing child being lifted into the air. This wasn't just about her grandmother. This was about something that had happened to him in a place just like this. Emma, he whispered, the name escaping like a prayer or a curse. My daughter. She died in a hospital just like this one. The words hit Amora like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. The emptiness in his house, the walls he'd built around his heart, the way he flinched from any emotional connection. He'd lost a child. Stone, she said softly, reaching for his hand. I'm so sorry. She was 7, he continued, as if he couldn't stop the words now that they'd started. Leukemia. The doctors said she had a good chance, that the treatments were working. But her mother, my ex-wife, she took Emma to Europe for some experimental treatment without telling me. Said she couldn't trust me to make the right decisions about our daughter's care. His voice cracked, revealing the raw wound beneath years of scar tissue. Emma died in a hospital in Switzerland, he said. Alone, except for her mother. And I never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell her one more time that Daddy loved her. Amora felt her heart break for this man who had carried such devastating loss alone for so long. How long ago? 15 years. And I swore I would never set foot in another hospital, never put myself in a position where I could lose someone He stopped, seeming to realize what he'd almost said. Someone you love, Amora finished quietly. Stone's eyes met hers, and in them she saw 15 years of carefully buried grief and the terrifying realization that he was on the verge of caring about someone again. I can't lose another person I care about in a place like this, he said. I won't survive it twice. The elevator doors opened behind them, and Amora faced an impossible choice. She could go upstairs alone to face whatever was happening with Grandma Rose, or she could stay here with this broken man who had just trusted her with the most painful truth of his life. She chose him. Then we'll wait here, she said, taking his hand. Together. No, Stone said, shaking his head. You need to be with your grandmother. I'll be fine. You're not fine, Amora said firmly. And neither am I. But maybe we can be not fine together. For a moment, They stood there in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital waiting room, two people who had spent their lives learning to carry their pain alone, discovering what it might feel like to share that burden. Then Stone squeezed her hand and said the words that would change everything between them. "Let's go see about your grandmother." The walk to the elevator felt like crossing a bridge that Stone had burned 15 years ago. Each step was agony, each breath a conscious decision to keep moving forward instead of running back to the safety of his walls. But Amora's hand in his was an anchor, a reminder that some things were worth facing your worst fears. Room 314 was a standard hospital room made somehow sacred by the presence of the tiny woman lying in the bed surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. Rose Washington looked impossibly small beneath the white blankets, her dark skin ashen and her breathing labored, but her eyes were alert and focused on her granddaughter with fierce love. "There's my baby girl," she whispered as Amora rushed to her side. "Don't you cry over me, Amora. I'm not going anywhere yet." "Grandma," Amora sobbed, taking the older woman's hand. "I was so scared." "I know, baby. But fear is just love with nowhere to go." Rose's eyes moved to Stone, who stood awkwardly near the door, looking like he wanted to flee. "And who is this handsome man you brought with you?" "This is Harrison Sterling," Amora said, wiping her eyes. "My employer. Stone, this is my grandmother, Rose." Rose studied Stone with the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent 74 years learning to read people. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Thank you for bringing my granddaughter to me." "It was nothing," Stone replied, but his voice was hoarse with emotion. "It was everything," Rose corrected gently. "And from the look on your face, I'd say this place brings back some painful memories for you." Stone stiffened, clearly not expecting such directness from a woman he'd just met. "I lost someone close to me in a hospital," he said carefully. "Your child," Rose said, and it wasn't a question. Stone's composure cracked completely. "How did you?" "Because that's the only loss that leaves marks like the ones you're carrying," Rose said with infinite compassion. "What was her name?" "Emma," Stone whispered, and saying it aloud in this place felt like opening a wound that had never properly healed. "She was 7. Tell me about her." And somehow, sitting in that sterile hospital room beside the bed of a woman he'd met 5 minutes ago, Stone found himself talking about his daughter for the first time in 15 years. He told Rose about Emma's laugh, about how she used to climb into his lap during board meetings via video call, about the way she could light up a room just by existing in it. "She sounds like she was perfect," Rose said when he finished. "She was," Stone said, tears streaming down his face. "And I failed her. I wasn't there when she needed me most." "No," Rose said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived decades of loss and heartbreak. "You loved her. That's never a failure. Love is the only thing that outlasts death, the only thing that makes the pain worth carrying." Stone looked at this remarkable woman, Amora's grandmother, the person who had shaped the compassionate, fearless young woman who had walked into his life and turned it upside down, and felt something shift inside his chest. "She gets it from you," he said quietly. "What's that?" "Amora. Her courage, her ability to see through people's defenses. She gets it from you." Rose smiled, and for a moment, the hospital room felt less like a place of sickness and more like a sanctuary. "That girl has been taking care of people since she was 8 years old. It's just who she is. But she's never had anyone take care of her the way she deserves." Stone's eyes moved to Amora, who was holding her grandmother's other hand and crying silently. In that moment, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic, he made a decision that terrified him more than any business deal or corporate merger ever could. He was going to let himself love this woman. Completely, desperately, with all the broken pieces of his heart. And if it destroyed him, if it left him bleeding on the floor of his own life, at least he would have chosen love instead of fear. Do you think Stone is ready to fully open his heart to Amora after losing his daughter? Can he overcome 15 years of protecting himself, or will his fear still hold him back? Let us know your thoughts. The doctor arrived an hour later with news that was both devastating and hopeful. Rose's condition was serious. Her diabetes had progressed to the point where she would need intensive treatment and round-the-clock care. But she was stable, and with the right medical intervention, she could have months or even years left. The cost, however, was astronomical. Even with insurance, the treatments would run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money that Amora simply didn't have. "We'll figure it out," Amora said, though her voice shook with the weight of an impossible situation. "There are programs, payment plans." "No," Stone said quietly. "There aren't. Not for this level of care. He turned to the doctor. What would it cost for the best possible treatment? Everything she needs, private room, the top specialists. The doctor looked uncomfortable. Mr. Sterling, I'm not sure. A number. Give me a number. Approximately $400,000. Stone didn't even blink. Done. Send the bills to my office. He pulled out a business card and handed it to the stunned doctor. And I want her transferred to the VIP wing immediately. Whatever she needs. The silence that followed was deafening. Amora stared at Stone like she was seeing a stranger, while Rose watched the exchange with knowing eyes. Stone, Amora said finally, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything, Stone interrupted. I'm choosing to do this. But why? Amora's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you do this for us? Stone looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the tears streaking her cheeks, the fierce love in her eyes as she gripped her grandmother's hand, the way she had stood by him in his moment of panic instead of abandoning him for her own crisis. Because, he said, his voice rough with emotion, 15 years ago, I lost the most important person in my world. And I swore I would never care about anyone enough to feel that kind of pain again. But then you walked into my life with your impossible courage and your refusal to let me hide behind my walls, and you made me remember what it feels like to be human. He moved closer to the bed, closer to both women who had somehow become the center of his universe in the span of a few weeks. I'm paying for your grandmother's treatment because I love you, Amora Washington, and I would rather risk losing you than live one more day without telling you that. The words hung in the air like a confession and a prayer. Amora's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she stared at this man who had just torn down every wall he'd spent 15 years building. You love me, she whispered. Terrifyingly, Stone admitted. Completely. In a way that makes me want to be the man you see when you look at me instead of the man I've been hiding behind. Rose squeezed Amora's hand, drawing their attention back to her. Baby girl, she said softly. This man just offered to move heaven and earth for someone he's known for 3 weeks. You might want to tell him how you feel before he changes his mind. Amora looked from her grandmother to Stone, seeing in his eyes the same vulnerability and terror that she felt in her own heart. This wasn't just about attraction or gratitude. This was about two broken people finding something in each other that made them want to be whole again. I love you too, she said, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. I love you so much it scares me. I love your wounded heart and your impossible stubbornness and the way you've been protecting yourself so carefully that you forgot you were worth protecting. I love that you're here, in this place that terrifies you, because you couldn't let me face this alone. Stone crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with 15 years of stored-up longing and the desperate relief of someone who had been drowning and suddenly found air. Amora melted into him, tasting salt from both their tears and feeling the frantic beating of his heart against her chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rose was watching them with a smile that could have powered the entire hospital. Well, she said with satisfaction, it's about time you two figured that out. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Harrison Sterling sat in a hospital chair holding the hand of the woman he loved while her grandmother, who had become his family in the span of a single afternoon, slept peacefully in a bed that would be her home for the next several weeks. For the first time in 15 years, Stone wasn't thinking about the walls he'd built or the pain he'd been protecting himself from. He was thinking about the future, about morning coffee shared with someone who knew his worst secrets and loved him anyway, about the sound of laughter in his empty house, about the possibility that love might be worth the risk after all. Emma would have liked Amora, he realized, would have loved her fearless spirit and kind heart. And maybe, just maybe, his daughter would have wanted him to be happy again. The thought didn't take away the grief, nothing ever would, but it made it bearable in a way it had never been before. As if reading his thoughts, Amora squeezed his hand. What are you thinking about? Emma, Stone said quietly, and how she would have loved having you and Rose as family. Family, Amora repeated, testing the word like it was something precious and fragile. If you'll have us, Stone said. All of us. My broken heart, my empty house, my completely inexperience with normal relationships. Amora smiled through her tears. Normal is overrated anyway. And as the machines continued their steady beeping and the city lights began to twinkle beyond the hospital windows, two people who had spent their lives learning to survive alone discovered what it meant to choose love over fear, hope over safety, and each other over the comfortable loneliness that had defined them for so long. It was, Stone thought, the best decision he'd ever made.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.